So you went from Socrates to a disciple of his. This particular fellow who claimed to be a student of Socrates turned out to be a tyrant, pushed people around, and whatever the case may be, is what tyrants usually do. And then you ask, he didn't turn out like Plato, perhaps because he didn't love Socrates enough? Or maybe he had some habits that, despite being around Socrates as long as he was, perhaps the habits were more powerful than the presence of Socrates to be able to change them. Is that? Not really. Tyrannical habits, I mean. You know, there are a few things and I think I've shared this before, but you know, Hussein had a mini mart. He sold cheese and bread, cups and sugar and tea. He didn't have a PhD after his name. He didn't have a position, unless you were extremely poor, that you would covet. I mean, you wouldn't say, I want to be an owner of a mini mart. You know, you wouldn't go to your parents and say, Mom, I think I have found what I want to do. I want to own a deli. When he started having his gatherings, if he didn't like what someone would say, he would just lash out. He would just tell them that they don't really understand. In fact, they're just stupid. And on a few occasions, some of these people in the middle of the gathering, they would just get up and leave. And I think on one occasion, when he was just a bit too harsh and unkind, and the person left with, I think, his daughter or his son, I went out with them and I made some excuse. And he just said, no, leave them, let them go. And that particular type of a personality or response to a guest at your home, it wasn't something that people would desire to do. You know, it's not like, again, you go to your mom or your dad and say, I think I want to approach people just like that. And his personality and his character and the way he behaved, it reminded me sometimes of some Christians knocking on Gurdjieff's door and saying, we're looking for Gurdjieff. and Gurdjieff would pick up a broom and chase after them, and they would just run away. Or if someone wanted to talk about spiritual things, occult things, Gurdjieff, and they were looking for Gurdjieff, he would say, I have no idea who he is, I've never seen him or heard of him. And it's important because you're dealing with someone who's not looking for attention. That's the first thing. Hussein was not looking for attention. Gurdjieff was not looking for attention. He was looking for students. Now, because he had a hot temper, it wasn't something that people enjoyed. And because he had a deli, it wasn't an occupation that people aspired to have. And so there had to be something about this man that would attract you. It wasn't his social status, and it wasn't the manner of his speech. It was harsh. It was, at least if you didn't know him, he sounded profoundly self-righteous. So in many ways, what you heard was very unpleasant and unattractive. And then the question is, well, why would anyone want to hang out with this guy? Let's say someone gets their bachelor's from some school in philosophy. And let's say they get it from Stanford or Yale or Brown or Berkeley. And a friend of theirs tells them, there's a chap at Laney College, some lowly inner city school. Maybe we should just go and sit and see what's going on. Okay. So let's just say they come to my class. I'm not claiming to be good in the classroom at all, just giving it as an example. Now, there are a couple of things. When they enter the classroom, they realize there are about 60 people sitting. They also realize that when I talk, for example, everyone quiets down. They also realize it's not just that they quiet down, they also pay attention. And it's not that you just pay attention, they're also inspired, they get excited. And they also realize that when the class ends after 3 hours, 15, 20 people stay behind. And they say, well, that doesn't make any sense. This guy talked and talked and talked for 3 hours. You would expect people to be tired and have to go home, But no, they want to stay. There is nothing that they're seeing that repulses them. In fact, it creates a great amount of desire inside them. That I like this power, I like this attention. Add to it, the fact that they come and ask, so do you have any degrees? And I say, yes, I have a few degrees. How easy is it to get a tenure track position? You say, well, it's very difficult, but once you get the position, you can basically teach in the classroom the way you want to, the way it fits you. And I'm not talking about their physical life, what they have been through. I'm not talking about the possibility of them having a traumatic psychological experience. that has deep roots inside them, that has sabotaged basically their physical life, their relationships throughout their life. It only takes them perhaps one class meeting to all of a sudden have this desire that yes, maybe they should also do their PhD. Maybe they should also start looking for a full-time philosophy position. And at least initially in their imagination, once they get this position, then they can teach 5 or 6 or 10 classes. And they'll probably be able to inspire more people, for example, than I, excite students much more intensely than I, have students visit their office more often than I. So they have all these assumptions. Eventually they will get their PhD and eventually they will get a full-time job. That is a great amount of power that they now have. See, their journey started with them seeing something, having a desire, and then wanting to make that desire a reality. It took them about 10 years. They never saw and they were never tested how they will do once they have power. These are two different things. You can be a great student because you've been inspired to perhaps do philosophy the way Socrates did. An inspiration means that there's a part of you that breaks. It breaks open. This desire comes forth where you say, I want to do philosophy. And the desire, the seed is strong enough to push all the other desires away. You don't want to do geography, you don't want to do math, you don't want to do history, you just want to focus on philosophy. But Socratic philosophy. You have not been broken the way Socrates has. You don't have a teacher that Socrates had. You don't have the temperament that Socrates had. Socrates was trained by a woman who lived in a hut. You're in a classroom. Socrates went out, asked people questions, and most often he was demonized. And he was okay with being demonized. You, on the other hand, have never tasted any of that stuff. You speak, people get excited, and then they praise you. So what you have is initially you're inspired by Socrates, you desire to follow him, and you do. There's a great amount of poverty as students because you're not yet accomplished. You don't yet have what your teacher has. So you go through this journey. And let's say you complete the journey. You have your PhD. Your dependency on Socrates decreases because everything has a timetable. Even when you look at Plato, yes, Plato used his writings and he used Socrates as a mouthpiece for his writings. But then there came a point where Socrates becomes completely absent in his works. It's all Plato now. At this point, Plato is independent. Plato no longer needs Socrates to speak for him or through him. Now, if your question is, was it the lack of love? No, I don't think it's the lack of love for Socrates that makes a follower or student of Socrates behave like a tyrant. You pursue Socrates as long as you have need of Socrates. Some needs could be genuine, authentic. Some needs could be somewhat counterfeit. Only time will tell. There comes a point where the presence of Socrates is no longer sufficient for you. It no longer does what it used to. And it happens to all of us. The people that we idealized or worshipped was the center of, gravity for us is no longer the case. So we begin to kind of move around and look for other things. Sure, there is some part of you that's still connected to Socrates, but as time passes, that connection begins to fade. And it goes to the footnotes, maybe the endnotes. You don't see it as often or as much or as intensely. Once that detachment happens, and to some extent you know what you're doing when you're going, there comes a point where you are close to the finish line. Let's just say you do finish. And now someone hands you a degree. You begin to fill out some applications, you get some interviews, and you get a job. That's some real power you now have. You have 60 students who come to your class and you sit. And they sit. And they want to listen to you. You have never had this much power in your life. You have never been tested. This power has not lived inside you and it hasn't manifested. It hasn't been given long enough time for you to once in a while realize your errors. And so what happens, it's like Marcus Aurelius. He begins to write his stuff, the meditations. After he has conquered many cities and countries, after he's killed a lot of people, he's gotten a little older, he's become a little more reflective, and that's what happens when you get a little older, you become aware of your own mortality. And then, because of his temperament perhaps, because of perhaps some of the things that he experienced, he couldn't sleep. He began to ask why, and then he began to write. And despite writing, he continued to conquer lands. He continued to kill people. And so, what you have is a man who has nothing, journeys towards having. He has it. In having, he has a tremendous amount of power. And he becomes intoxicated by the power that is given to him. He does all sorts of things. But then you have to wait. And you have to wait. And you have to wait to see whether or not he will live long enough to be tested by the power that he has. You have to wait to see if he'll live long enough to once in a while feel the pangs of shame and guilt and remorse. If he will live long enough to have moments of repentance. And what happens when you live long enough, or when you have these experiences where you have, let's just say, you have power now, you have forgotten your past, which was one of poverty. You no longer remember the poverty. All you know is that you have power now. There is this beautiful poem, I'm not sure who it's by. به حریم خلوت خود شبی چه شود که نهفته بخوانیم به کنار من بنشینی و به کنار خود بنشانیم من اگرچه پیرم و ناتوان تو مرا ز درگه خود مران که گذشته در غمت ای جوان همه روزگار جوانیم. And it may be a parent to a child. It may be someone who was once young but now old. Let's just say it's about a parent to a child. به حریم خلوت خود شبی چه شود که نهفته بخوانیم. Is it possible that you can call me into your space for just a few minutes so I can come and sit with you? So that I can sit with you and you can sit with me. You look at me now and you say, wow, you've gotten so old. And I've become old because I've been carrying the worries of how to raise you in an environment that is vulturous, how to protect you. I spent my youth in raising you and protecting you and making you become somebody. And now that you have become somebody, don't forget me, that I've become old and feeble and weak. And it's an interesting phenomenon because for the first 10 years of my encounter with Hussein, it would be very difficult for me to look at him. All these emotions would overcome me. I had like a good amount of shame in looking at him. There is this great scene in the Gospel of Judas that when Judas is talking, when Jesus is talking, all the disciples look at him, stare him in the face or in the eye, but it's only Judas who's unable to kind of gaze into his eyes. He feels small, he feels ashamed, he has far too much respect for this man, so he always just averts, his eyes. And it's kind of like a man who loves a woman or a woman who loves a man, and at the stage they're at, it's only, you have no idea if the other person likes you and you don't want to get caught. So you look at this person and you have basically unclothed, undressed yourself in the sense that your gaze is such that the other person knows how much you care for them. So you kind of just look away, or you sneeze, or you say, I gotta go to the bathroom, or you create some excuse. So the first 10 years, even this is not about, of course, the people who come here, but our own experiences as the three men in the room with him. The three of us were very, 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 very close. Hussein, Mihdad, and myself. But when we went to his house, we would never talk. It was this like sacred space. Hi, how are you? How's the family? How's work? No one smiled. No one laughed. Our gossip was limited to maybe 30 seconds, maybe a minute. We sat very properly. There was this sorrow and sadness that all of us embodied. And then I started doing my master's, and then I started doing my PhD. And then, of course, by then the gatherings had finished. But now when people would have conversations, I would try to correct Hussein. Not in private, in public. And I would try to some extent, impress him, maybe even embarrass him with all the knowledge that I had, but he didn't. I could talk about Western philosophy. I could talk to some extent about art, about Renaissance, about this or that. And these are information that he didn't have. Because that's not how the Persian culture worked, at least at that time for him. He was only interested in religion, but not philosophy, and certainly not art, even though his wife was an artist. And then on a few occasions when we had music gatherings, he would sing, but then I would say, he's not singing the right way. And his voice isn't really that good tonight. So as he's singing, all of a sudden I would jump in. And because I was told by many I had a nice voice, he would slowly just become invisible and I would take over. "20 years pass. And I think it's only 20 years later do I realize my errors. That this is a man who basically raised me, that I went to him in poverty. I was just this confused little kid. He provided all sorts of things for me and others. But then I got intoxicated. I got drunk with the degrees I had. Got drunk with the information that I had. That when I was teaching at Sacramento State, he came and sat in a couple of my classes. And then he said, "Amir, you did really, really good." And then I forgot about my poverty and how he enriched me, how he helped me, how he protected me, how he nourished me for all those years. Then while drunk, once in a while, not all the time, once in a while I would forget. And in my forgetfulness, I would oppose him when there were conversations that I thought that he was just wrong. And I remember at one point my brother came to me the following day after I actually had raised my voice and said, "No, you're wrong," to him. He said to me, my brother Iraj, "Amir, be careful." So I had become a tyrant. And if you have paid attention the past, maybe, some time that you've come here and to the class and to the office perhaps, a good amount of my conversation revolves around Hussein. And it's about all the things that he had done, And so going back to the poem, he had gotten old. He had lost his power. There were no longer gatherings. As you get old, you kind of lose your interest in talking to people about these things anyways. And so I was becoming more visible. I was in the classroom now. I had power. And I remember he came with his wife and his daughter, and he stayed here in this house for a couple of nights. And we went to Lakeshore. And this was around the time when I had a bit more patience. And my classes were a bit more fun. I wasn't as mean as I am now. And so as we walked around Lakeshore for about 2-3 hours playing soccer and volleyball, every 2 minutes a student would come and say, "Hey, Amir, what's going on? We miss you." And then around like 2 or 3, him and I and a few other people went to Subway, got some sandwiches, and all these students and my family and Hussein and his wife and his daughter, we all sat and ate. When we came home, he looks at me and says, "Amir, you really liked." I said, "Yeah, okay. Why don't you run for mayor? You'll get the votes." I said, "Mayor, what do mayors do?" "I don't want to be a mayor. I like to be in the classroom." And I say this because he had also given me compliments. So I even got more drunk, you know. And I think all of us fall victim to this, that you forget your past, how difficult it was. And that's one of the things. The moment you forget where you come from, the moment you forget your past, it's like the components that have the power to baptize you and keep you awake and keep you alert. And it's not going to happen all the time. Of course, all of us, fall victim to, these things from time to time. But, some people more than others. And you don't have to talk about Socrates and Plato. Um, a son who gets beat up by his father when he's growing up. At a certain point, he has enough money, enough courage where he just packs up and leaves. And he doesn't say goodbye. And he vows to never be like his father. And so time passes, and, he goes out there, finds himself a companion as a child, goes home one day. It's been a difficult day. And, he hasn't processed his past really well. And the past has kind of remained in the background, and he hasn't been aware of it. His son or his daughter runs to him, or maybe his wife, just to say hello and give him a hug. And because he's had a rough day, he just kind of physically hurts them. And we all have those moments where you had made yourself some promises that you're never going to be, like this person or that person, or you're never going to exhibit this behavior, that behavior. Now, when you kind of do such things to your kids and they're young and they kind of break down and cry, you remember. And, there's a great amount of repentance that takes place within you. And it's something you can't even forgive yourself for having done. And again, I'm going back to your, question of how can someone who was with Socrates all of a sudden become a tyrant? Um, I don't know. Maybe there wasn't a book written about him. Maybe he left all of his powers, went in the desert, lived as a recluse somewhere, where he became a monk sitting in a cave in darkness and just praying for forgiveness. I don't know. But, no one remains a tyrant all the time. They have their private moments. But I think whenever you reach autonomy, when you become independent, I think the other necessary component is you really, really, really have to be broken in the right way. Uh, when you're broken in the right way, I say you have to be broken in the right way, I mean, imagine there's a kid who's riding his bicycle, and you hear that when he puts on the brake on his bike, it squeaks a little, and you hear the noise. And you kind of get worried, and you tell the kid, stop for a moment, let me fix this brake for you. And then as you try to fix the brake, the whole thing falls apart. Now, the brake wasn't broken. It was about to be broken, but it wasn't broken yet. Maybe, it would have fallen apart 10 years from now, but you broke it. Now, the kid sits there, he's very sad, maybe he's even crying, blaming you for having broken his or her bike. And then you say, don't worry, I'll fix it. And you go to your trunk, you grab your toolbox, and the kid, you see him or her being sad. You say, wait, I'll be right back. You go to your room or to your apartment. You grab a bucket of ice cream. You say, why don't you have some ice cream while I'm doing this? And if you're hungry, I can order pizza. And the guy says, yeah, it's not a bad thing. I'm going to get a brand new brake, job on the bike, pizza, ice cream, getting a tan. And so after 20, 30, 40 minutes, the bike is fixed. His belly is full. He's had his ice cream, and now he goes, riding his bike with brand new brakes. If someone breaks you and has the ability to protect you, and by protecting, I mean that this person will give you perhaps the most valuable thing, time, patience, food, clothing. And I'm not talking about metaphoric stuff. This is like real, like food. It's like it's raining. You rode your bicycle to Hussein's house. You're wet. He looks at you and says, do you have extra clothes? You say, no. He says, come to my room. I go there. Hussein was a big man. There's socks, some sweats, and this is a shirt. Brand new. Okay? Thank you. And then after you wear the clothes, the wife comes in, gives you some tea, and then the conversation begins for about 4 or 5 hours. And then one of your, friends at the gathering gives you a ride home. And then the gatherings continue and continue and continue until you become somewhat autonomous. And once you gain your independence, then, there is hope that you can remember to go back and kind of show your appreciation in some shape or form. Let me also say a little bit of the various shades of tyrannical personalities. Plato didn't like people. I mean, neither did Socrates, but Socrates was a man of society. He would go to the market every day and talk. Plato would never do that. For Plato, seeing what the city had done to Socrates, seeing what politics had done to Socrates, seeing what people who assume to know had done to Socrates, what these famed people in society had done to Socrates' reputation. He decided not to talk to people and not to inspire the common person. So what he does is he creates a cult. And before you can enter the gates to a school, you have to pass a couple of exams. And then it's not like democracy where people just sit and talk. There are certain things you just need to do. You need to do math. You need to do music. You need to do physical education. And you need to listen to Plato when he talks. It's very, very strict and very disciplined. Is it true that Plato was drunk with power? Yeah. Is it true that perhaps for Plato, power meant knowing a few things about what wisdom is, about what love is, about what it means to serve a teacher, about what it means to be educated. And he knew that, the general public is just not equipped for all that. That's a good place to be. It's good to be around such tyrants. They make your life really tough, but I think if anyone is able to survive that particular environment, they'll come out, much better than when they first went in. You can't be a student and be a tyrant. It doesn't work. You can be a student and be a tyrant to other people, but you can't be a tyrant in the presence of your teacher. It never works. And I use the word teacher and student, that you have someone who gives and you have someone who receives. That as a student, you have realized that there is something that this person gives you, and it makes you passive. Now, you could be passive with love, you could be passive without love, without this emotion. And you have to be passive. Passive makes you empty. And it doesn't mean that what you receive, you understand. It just means that you receive. Just because you receive, it doesn't mean you understand. It just means you feel a great deal. And you want to control the feelings by understanding the feelings, but that's never going to happen. You have to just kind of just receive for a long, long time and go through this roller coaster of emotions. One day you're good, 10 days you're bad. One day you feel joy, 20 days you feel sorrow. You have no idea where your life is going. But because you have a support system, because this person broke you, because they have given you a space now where that brokenness can kind of find itself to be meaningful, you stay there. You stay there and you continue receiving until, and no one knows how this happens, until as a student, you're able to connect some dots together. You begin to not just feel, but you begin to understand. And in your feeling and understanding, you try to express with your questions, with your comments to your teacher that I'm on the right track. But then you fumble linguistically. Because at every stage, you need to be trained differently. First you need to be trained in feeling things the right way. But then you overstep your boundary because you say, okay, now that I feel, I think I understand. But you have to just feel and feel and feel for, I don't know, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 years. And then there comes a point where the feelings organically subside. They diminish in intensity. And your task is now to understand. The problem with desiring to understand or being at a place where you understand is you won't feel anything and you're going to miss it. I remember there came a point where, someone used to come to me at various places I used to teach, and they used to say, "Oh, I cry so much. I'm so sad. I'm so this. I'm so that." I would always tell them, this is a very, very special place to be. Take advantage of it. Write poetry. If you're religious, pray. If, you have all these feelings, you read the dialogues of Plato, read Kierkegaard, read books, because you will inject your emotions into all the things that you read, listen to good music, have great conversations. I would tell them this stage is not going to last for too long. There comes a point where you won't feel a damn thing. You'll go to the funeral and the person who's passed is your father, and you won't shed a tear. You want to, but you can't. Because feelings has to do with your intense and very strong attachment to something. When you want to understand something, especially if the desire to understand comes organically, it's like this butcher has this beautiful sharp knife, cuts your emotions from you. You see, but you don't feel. All you want to do is to understand. And then the problem with desiring to understand is you'll have feelings. Understanding will give you some emotions, but they're very, very different in quality, And then time passes and you say, I want to feel, I just can't. So, well, I told you to just appreciate those moments where you felt so intensely, where you want to scream or cry or whatever. Now you're just floating around. You want to feel, but nothing touches you because nothing can touch you. That stage is no longer yours. And then you get to a place where you've had the stage of feelings, intense emotions, then understanding, then the sort of emotions later on that come with understanding. And then you realize after a while that your mind and your body is exhausted. They're both very, very tired. So you no longer want to feel, you no longer want to think, you no longer want to understand. And there is no longer a desire to express how you feel or what you understand about anything. And it reminds me of, two lives really. One life is Rumi's and the other is Gurdjieff's. The last few years of Gurdjieff's life, he kind of did things and expressed things in a very religious way. When he was younger and had perhaps more patience, he explained things really, really well, very clearly. Near the end of his life, that wasn't the case. The last maybe 5 to 7 years of Rumi's life, he didn't write a single line. He just didn't. Maybe he wasn't inspired. Maybe, he felt as if he was done saying all that needed to be said. But it's a place, that I think comes to whether you are reflective or philosophical or not, that you kind of just, after a while, become old enough where The stuff that you cared for, you no longer care for. And I remember the scene from Gladiator, where I think it's Marcus Aurelius, if I'm not forgotten, calls the soldier to his tent and says, I want to give you Rome. And this guy says, you have a son. Give it to your son. He says, no, he's not fit. He's raw. He hasn't been tested by life. He's too intoxicated. He'll use that power and abuse everyone, including himself. Where he comes to realize, whoever this guy is, Marcus Aurelius in this movie, I think, he's getting old. He doesn't want to see bloodshed anymore. He is done with conquering lands. It doesn't give him much pleasure. And what he worked for, building Rome for 30 years, just wants to give it away to someone else, but someone who's fit. Forgive me for rambling on about all sorts of things. Both of you know the prodigal son story really, really well, better than I. Imagine Socrates to be the father who has raised Plato. There comes a point where Plato looks at Socrates and says, let me run your school. And Socrates says, no, let me run your school. You're not ready. Let me run your school. No. And behind his back, he steals a couple of students. And he begins to talk, and people are impressed because he can mimic Socrates really well. He can shout and scream, be somewhat animated. And Socrates catches him. But by then, you have some students gravitating towards Plato. There isn't much that Socrates can do, except to hope, perhaps pray if he's religious, that hopefully soon Socrates will run out of things to say because it's not organic, because it's not his voice. It's all plagiarism. Everything is. And eventually he'll get caught. And when he comes to realize that he's been faking it, grief will come over him, repentance will come over him, sadness, and then he'll come back to me, Socrates, and say, I'm really, really sorry for going behind your back and stealing students and talking about things I don't really get. And at that stage, Socrates receives him, and now he has tasted, he has tasted what it means to be a fake, what it means to be getting caught, not by someone from the outside, by your own self. And having a place to go back to, that the very man who taught you and you betrayed him, now you're lucky enough that he's still alive, that you can go back to Socrates, but now you go back to Socrates differently. You have tasted power. You have come to realize you really don't know. And now for the first time, Socrates can really, really teach you things, And then, just as Socrates is about to die, he looks at Plato and says, you should run my school. And Plato says, I don't want to. You have no choice, run the school. And he does. But now he has wisdom within him. And that's really the story of prodigal son. And that's all of our stories, really, And you don't have to be powerful by having money. You can be powerful by being animated. You can be powerful by speaking well. You can be powerful by having degrees. You can be powerful by having good looks. and you have no choice but to get drunk. You kind of just lose yourself in it. And then, if you're lucky, having bullied enough people, having wasted enough time on ridiculous things, you can kind of go back and become the good student that you once were. That you know your boundaries well, you know what lines to cross, what lines not to cross. So, the young teachers are always dangerous. For anyone who's young in any profession, you could be 90 and be young in a profession. Um, yeah.